Before Tyreek Hill, before Olympic speed was common in the NFL, there was Bob Hayes, the fastest man in the world and one of the most important players the game ever saw. He won Olympic gold, he changed NFL defenses forever, he helped bring Dallas its first Super Bowl, and somehow his story faded. This is about rediscovering a legend, giving him his credit, and telling the full story, the greatness, the struggle, and the humanity behind the speed. If you care about forgotten greatness in real sports history, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's bring Bob Hayes' name back where it belongs. Bob Hayes didn't arrive to greatness with cameras waiting or headlines ready. His story began in a version of America that wasn't built to celebrate him or even acknowledge him. He grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, in the heart of segregation-era football. At Matthew Gilbert High School, a black school competing in a separate athletic world, Hayes was already redefining what speed looked like on a football field. As a halfback, he powered an undefeated 12-0 season, culminating in a black state championship victory in front of more than 11,000 people. It should have been one of the most celebrated high school teams in Florida history. Instead, it barely made the record books. That team wouldn't receive real recognition until half a century later. This was the pattern from the start. Bob Hayes doing historic things in spaces America didn't prioritize remembering. When it came time for college, Hayes chose Florida A&M, an HBCU that produced excellence without exposure. There, he wasn't just fast, he was transformational. He dominated track meets without the perfect sprinter form, exploded past competitors with raw power and instinct. He shattered world records in the 60-yard dash, the 100-yard dash, and beyond, becoming the first man to ever break 6 indoor records. Coaches, scouts, and spectators didn't fully understand what they were seeing. Hayes didn't look like the prototype. He didn't run like the textbook said he should, he just kept winning. Even then, opportunity came with resistance. His head football coach, Jake Gaither, initially hesitated to let Hayes focus on Olympic training. It took a phone call from President Lyndon B. Johnson himself to make sure that the fastest man in America was allowed the chance to chase history. That detail alone tells you everything about the era and about how close the world came to never fully seeing Bob Hayes at all. Before the gold medals, before the Cowboys, before the NFL changed its defenses, Bob Hayes was already a legend. He just wasn't loud. He wasn't promoted. He wasn't protected. He was simply faster than the world around him and running in a lane that history rarely looked down. By the early 1960s, Bob Hayes wasn't just winning races, he was breaking the sport itself. Wherever he ran, records followed. World records, meet records, expectations that no longer made sense once he exploded off the line. And he was doing it without the polished technique coaches preferred. In 1964, the world finally caught up to him in Tokyo. The Olympic stage is where legends are usually introduced. For Bob Hayes, it was where disbelief ended. Lined up in lane 1, wearing borrowed spikes because one of his shoes had disappeared. Hayes still delivered, no excuses, no reruns, just speed. When the gun fired in the 100 meters, Hayes didn't just win, he surged through chaos and conditions that should have slowed him down, crossing the line in what was officially recorded as 10 seconds flat. But the truth was faster. Hand timers clocked him at 9.9. Automatic timing had him even quicker. History would split hairs over the decimals, but none of it changed the outcome. Bob Hayes was an Olympic champion. Then came the relay, the moment that turned awe into mythology. France had the lead, the gold medal was slipping away. And then Hayes took the baton. What followed wasn't a race, it was a demonstration. In less than 9 seconds, he erased a deficit no one else could, running the fastest relay leg the sport had ever seen. That's all we need, his teammate had said beforehand. He was right. 2 gold medals, a world record, and just like that, Bob Hayes walked away from track forever at 21 years old. The world finally saw him, but it didn't fully understand what it was witnessing. Bob Hayes hadn't just won races, he had revealed a new ceiling for human speed, and he was only getting started. When Bob Hayes entered the NFL, the league didn't draft a finished wide receiver. It drafted a question it didn't yet know how to answer. Dallas took a chance on Olympic speed, not polish. Hayes arrived with limited football refinement, but the moment the ball was snapped, none of that mattered. In his rookie season, he didn't ease into the league. He rewrote the Cowboys' record yards per catch, a number that instantly exposed how unprepared defenses were for him. And it didn't stop there. In just his second season, Hayes led the NFL again, this time with 13 receiving touchdowns, finishing his first 2 years as the league's most prolific scoring receiver. Defenses realized quickly that no single cornerback could ever run with him. Man coverage collapsed, safeties backed up, entire game plans bent toward survival. The league's response changed football forever. Zone defense became mandatory. The bump and run was refined specifically to disrupt Hayes at the line. Teams weren't scheming to stop the Cowboys, they were scheming to stop Bob Hayes. And even when the ball didn't come his way, his presence dictated everything. Safety stayed deep, corners gave cushion, that fear opened lanes underneath, allowing Dallas's run game to thrive and turning Hayes into a weapon even without a catch. His impact went beyond receiving. In 1968, Hayes led the NFL in punt return average at 20.8 yards per return, adding another layer of danger every time he touched the ball. In the playoffs, he set an NFL record with 141 punt return yards in a single game, while also torching defenses for 145 receiving yards, including an 86-yard touchdown bomb. By the end of his career, Hayes had totaled 371 receptions, 7,414 yards, and 71 touchdowns, averaging 20 yards per catch, a Dallas Cowboys franchise record that still stands. The NFL adapted, the stats piled up, the wins followed. But as defenses adjusted, Bob Hayes' influence became quieter, and his credit slowly faded, even as the league continued to live inside the world he forced it to create. At some point, Bob Hayes stopped being remembered as a complete football player and started being reduced to a description: fast. That single word slowly replaced everything else. Teams weren't letting Hayes sprint freely downfield anymore, and the box score began to change: fewer deep shots, fewer headline catches. To the casual observer, it looked like decline. But this is where rediscovering the legend matters. During this phase of his career, Hayes transitioned from primary weapon to strategic force. Dallas's offense leaned into what his presence created: lighter boxes, stretched coverage, running lanes that didn't exist before he arrived. While his role evolved, the results stayed elite. He continued to produce, continued to score, and continued to show up in the biggest moments. By the time his career ended, Bob Hayes had earned 3 Pro Bowl selections, 4 All-Pro honors, and helped lead Dallas to 5 conference titles, 2 Super Bowl appearances, and a championship. Instead of being remembered as the man who forced the NFL to reinvent defense, Hayes became the track guy, the Olympic sprinter who could stretch the field, a specialist, a footnote next to more familiar receivers who came later, players who benefited from a league Hayes helped redesign. This is how legends fade, not through failure, but through simplification. Bob Hayes didn't disappear, the story just stopped telling the full version. When the cheering stopped, the silence hit harder than any defender ever could. After football, Bob Hayes entered a world that no longer revolved around schedule, structure, or purpose. The transition was abrupt. The fame faded, the income disappeared, and the identity that had carried him for decades — fastest man alive, Super Bowl champion, Olympic hero — no longer protected him from reality. In 1978, Hayes stood in a courtroom instead of a stadium. He pleaded guilty to selling cocaine to an undercover officer and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, ultimately serving 10 months. It was a moment that stunned the sports world and, for many, became the only part of his story they remembered. But this is where rediscovery matters most. Because Hayes never denied what he did, he didn't hide behind excuses. On the stand, he admitted his guilt plainly, saying he wasn't the smartest man in the world, and that if he were, he wouldn't be there. He spoke openly about hitting rock bottom financially, about losing respect, about how painful it was to feel his name reduced to a headline instead of a life. Some supporters believed he was targeted, others saw a fallen hero. The truth sits somewhere harder and more human: a man without a safety net, battling addiction, navigating life after being used up by systems that rarely teach athletes how to exist once the applause ends. Even then, he wasn't abandoned completely. Former teammates, including Roger Staubach and Cowboys leadership, showed up in courts to vouch for him, not to erase what he'd done, but to affirm who they believed he still was. That support didn't erase the consequences, it simply acknowledged the man behind the mistake. This chapter doesn't cancel Bob Hayes' greatness, but it explains why his story became uncomfortable to tell. History prefers clean legends, perfect arcs, easy heroes. Bob Hayes didn't fit that mold. So instead of wrestling with complexity, the sports world quietly moved on, allowing one chapter to overshadow a lifetime of impact. And in doing so, it forgot that accountability and legacy are not opposites. They are part of the same story. Redemption rarely looks the way movies promise it will. For Bob Hayes, there was no comeback tour, no standing ovations, no triumphant return to the spotlight. There was work, quiet work, uncelebrated work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but slowly rebuilds a life. After prison, Hayes continued to battle drug and alcohol addiction, entering rehabilitation programs multiple times. Progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, but there was also growth. He returned to Florida A&M and completed his bachelor's degree in elementary education in 1994, decades after first stepping on campus as a prodigy. It wasn't about optics, it was about finishing something he'd left unfinished. More importantly, Hayes began using his story to warn others. He spoke to young athletes about substance abuse, about the dangers waiting after the applause fades, and about the importance of education beyond sports. He didn't preach from a pedestal, he spoke from experience, from scars, from mistakes he never tried to erase. And slowly, the narrative began to correct itself. The Cowboys placed him in their Ring of Honor. Track and field welcomed him back. Football historians began to re examine just how much of the modern passing game traced back to one man forcing defenses into survival mode. In 2009, years after his death, Bob Hayes was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, finally cementing what had always been true. He was not a footnote, he was a foundation. Hayes is still the only athlete to win both an Olympic gold medal and a Super Bowl ring. His speed didn't just win races, it reshaped sports. His career didn't just produce highlights, it produced blueprints. And his life, complicated and imperfect, reminds us that greatness and struggle often coexist in the same person. Rediscovering Bob Hayes isn't about ignoring the hard parts of his story, it's about refusing to let them erase everything else. Legends don't disappear because they weren't great enough. They disappear when we stop telling their stories fully. In Bob Hayes' story, the speed, the sacrifice, the impact deserves to be told in full. If you learn something new about Bob Hayes, that's exactly why this channel exists. Leave a comment and tell me which forgotten legend you want a story on next. If you care about real sports history, like the video, subscribe, and help keep these stories alive. Because legends don't disappear, we bring them back up on Old School Sundays.